Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Amma ba'd. So welcome back to our course, An Introduction to Sharia, to Islamic Law. And today we begin the section looking at the second crucial aspect of Sharia, which is the Khilafat. So in the previous two lessons, we looked at the concept of the Qadi and the role that the Qadi plays in the Sharia system. Today we look at the other side of things, which is the Khilafat and the role that the Khalifa plays in a Sharia land. And the Khilafat is one of the most misunderstood concepts of our time, by Muslim and non-Muslim alike. Because there hasn't been a Khalifa for 100 years, many Muslims today have taken their understanding of what a Khalifa is from Western Orientalist stereotypes. And in trying to revive the Khilafat, instead of trying to revive the actual system that Muslims had for over 1,000 years, they try instead to revive something that never existed. A fantasy, really. And this is the case of what happened about a decade ago, just over a decade ago, in Syria with the so-called Islamic State. That their version of the Khilafat was so violent and so unsafe and so unjust that it actually pushed many Muslims away from these concepts of Khilafah and Sharia and made the religion look really, really bad. Anyone who studies history and studies the books of fiqh will immediately recognize that what they had established a decade ago was absolutely nothing to do with the Khilafat. It was an abomination built upon Orientalist stereotypes and an extremist understanding of Islam. So that what I hope to do over the next 2 or 3 videos is to explain properly what the Khilafat is, and we're going to divide this into various sections. We're going to look at what do the books of fiqh and Islamic law say about the role of the Khalifa and the duties of the Khalifa. We're going to look at the historical model of the Khilafat, the history of the Khilafat. We're going to extract from there how the Khilafat evolved and changed over time and how it functioned in different times in history. And then we're going to look at a case study of some of the Khalifas on different points in history to see what they had in common and what was different. And by doing that, we are able to understand what is a Khilafat, what is fixed, what is flexible, what is the rightly guided model, what are the other models, and what exactly should we as a ummah be striving for when it comes to reviving a political system. It was a bit of a difficult presentation to put together. There's not much literature on this topic in the English language. In Arabic, a lot of it is historical. I don't think much work has been done on what a Khilafat should look like today and what a 21st century Khilafat would be like. This is something that needs to be done. There is one paper that I shared with you from Yaqeen Institute called Who Wants the Khilafat by Dr. Waymir Anjum. It's a very important paper. I'll add it again to this video, where he basically discusses many of these things. What is the Khilafah, the history of the Khilafah, the different models of the Khilafah. In fact, a bulk of what I'm going to be presenting today is taken from his paper. Other aspects are taken from Hanafi fiqh books and from history books. From that paper, what's amazing is that he wrote this paper for Yaqeen Institute. And then from this paper came a new institute called Ummatics Institute that is dedicated to research on reviving the Khilafat and Sharia. And on that website, the paper has been translated into many languages, including Turkish, Urdu, and Arabic. So a very influential paper that I think is probably in English the most important thing that has been written on this topic. And it is one of 3 main sources that I'm using for this presentation, along with classical Hanafi fiqh books, which do discuss what is the role and function of the Khalifa, and history books from which I've been extracting the historical model of the Khilafat in our case studies. So let's begin. What is the Khilafat? And I recently gave a Jummah khutbah on this topic, which is basically a summary of this presentation. So we're going to go into a lot more details. The Jummah khutbah had to summarize this in 20 minutes. Here we have 2 or 3 hours, inshallah, to take our time and go through this in details. So the word Khalifa is taken from the Quran in Surah Baqarah, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's description of the human race, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala announces to the angels, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. I am creating a khalifa on earth. The Mufassirin, the scholars of tafsir, they say that there are 2 meanings of khalifa in this verse. The first meaning, the general meaning, is that every Muslim represents Allah's will on earth. Every Muslim, in their attempt to live by Islam and to preach Islam and to practice Islam and to stop others from sinning, they are a representation of Allah's will on earth. The other meaning of Khalifa that is taken from this verse is that this is the title for the Islamic political system. That the Islamic political system is called a Khilafat. A Khilafat means a successor. In this case, the political successor to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The title was first given to Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu when he became the ruler of the Muslim world after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away. People would refer to him as Khalifa to Rasulullah, the successor of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And after him there was political successor upon political successor, and they reached a point where there would be multiple at the same time, people claiming to be the political successor of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So one historical misconception that we need to clarify right at the beginning is that many people have this misconception that there was one Khalifa until 100 years ago. This is incorrect. Actually, only for the first 100 years there was one Khalifa. After that, we had the Umayyads, the Abbasids, and the Fatimids all coexisting while claiming to be the Khalifa. This is not ideal, but it is what it is. It's the history, right? And after that, more and more different people claim to be the Khalifa. So there's a difference between the ideal, which really didn't exist beyond the time of the Khulafa Rashidin, the rightly guided Khulafa, and the reality, what humans are capable of with our flaws and weaknesses. That's the way I look at it. The way I look at it is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Khulafa Rashidin established is beyond the capabilities of the average human being, because we are too weak to live up to that model. And so for the bulk of our history, we have a much more human Khilafat. It's not rightly guided. There's good and there's bad, there's mistakes, but the basic functions are still there. And because it's been missing for the past 100 years, we can see why it was necessary, and why even a Khilafat with flaws is still better than what we have today. The second point I want to make about the Khilafat is that there is a fiqhi dispute over whether the Khalifa needs to be from the Quraysh or not. We discussed this in the previous video, that Abu Sud Effendi was the one who popularized the idea of the Ottomans being Khalifas. But before that, this was a matter of dispute. So when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, and the Ansar were going to elect a Khalifa from them, from the Aus or Khazraj, the hadith was narrated to them that the successor must be from the Quraysh, or the leader must be from the Quraysh. And so they went with Abu Bakr as the Khalifa, and after Abu Bakr, Umar, and then Uthman, and then Ali, and then Hassan, and then Muawiyah. All of them are from the Quraysh, right? And really for the first 600 years of our history, the Khalifa was from the Quraysh. Because after that we have the Umayyads, who are Qurayshi. Then we have the Abbasids, the descendants of the Prophet's uncle Abbas radiallahu anhu, who are also Qurayshi. So for the first 600 years of our history, the Khalifa is Qurayshi. And even when we had three people claiming to be Khalifa at the same time, the Fatimids claimed to be the descendants of Hussein, Hassan or Hussein. They claim to be a descendant of Rasulullah through one of his grandsons. So they claim to be Qurayshi. The Umayyads in Spain were Qurayshi. The Abbasids in Baghdad were Qurayshi. So there were three people claiming to be the Khalifa at the same time, but they all were from the Quraysh. So for the first half of our history, this wasn't really a matter of dispute. The Khalifa was from the Quraysh. But then the Mongols invade, the Abbasid Khilafat is dismantled, and new empires arise. We have North African Muslim leaders. We have Turkish Muslim leaders. We have Persian Muslim leaders. We have Mamluk Muslim leaders. The Mamluk were slaves of Caucasian origin, right? Mostly Russian. None of these are Quraysh, right? None of these are Quraysh. And many of them claim to be the Khalifa. And this is where it starts to get a bit murky, because now, going back to that hadith, what do we do with it? Do we say the Khilafat ended with the Mongol invasion and that there was no Khalifa for the past 700 years or 500 years, because the Mamluks did claim to have an Abbasid with them who was the Khalifa, but they were the actual ones ruling and he literally had zero power, right? There was their technical way of getting around it. Or do we say the Khalifa does not have to be from the Quraysh, and then we go with the general historical model that the Khilafat was abolished in 1924 when the Ottoman Empire collapsed? That was the last Khalifa. So my opinion, and this is my opinion, feel free to disagree with it. My opinion is that this hadith, the leader must be from the Quraysh, is contextual to the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because the Arabs at that time were a very tribal society, and for that tribal society to unite under one leader, that leader had to be from the Quraysh, because the Quraysh were the only tribe that they all respected to that level. So for that first generation, it was necessary, while tribalism was still part of the Arab world, for the leader to be Qurayshi. As we move further away from the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and tribalism dies out, there's no real Qurayshis who have real power and who are worthy of the Khilafat, what do? Do we say there's no Khalifa unless he's Qurayshi, or do we say a Khalifa who is not Qurayshi is acceptable but not optimal? In my view, there's nothing wrong with the Khalifa being Turkish or North African or Persian or anything else, as long as they fulfill the requirements of the Khilafat. And that this was a recommendation for that time to keep the Arabs united in that first generation. Allah knows best. That's my understanding of the hadith and my understanding of the issue. You'll find historically there's been a lot of debate ever since the Ottomans claimed to be the Khalifas. There has been a lot of debate, and right until today there are people who do not accept the Ottomans as Khulafa, but rather as sultans, because they were not from the Quraysh. So it's important to be aware of that. So the Khilafat was a political system that was designed to facilitate the implementation of Sharia. The key concept here is that the Khalifa is a representative of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will on earth. He is a successor to the message of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the political entity that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam established in Arabia at that time. His job is to ensure that Allah's law is the law of the land. This is the job of the Khalifa, to ensure that Allah's law is the law of the land. And this is what the Khalifa did in good times and bad times. In times of having a righteous Khalifa, in times of having a not righteous Khalifa. For the bulk of our history, the state law, the de facto law, the law that everybody respected and considered to be what needs to be obeyed, was the Sharia. So only in 1924, when the Khilafat was abolished, that all of the Muslim lands now adapt an amalgamation of British law, French law, secular law, and Sharia law, creating this hodgepodge that we see today. But under the Khilafat, The Sharia is the law, and anything else supplements it. It can never override it. Right? And we'll come to this in later videos when we talk about things like adat, local culture, and qanun, canon law, how this supplemented the Sharia and did not override the Sharia. It's also stated in the books of fiqh, according to all four madhahib, that the Khilafat is a fard kifaya. It is a communal obligation. If someone is the Khalifa and Sharia is the law of the land, and there is a Darul Islam, a Islamic land, everybody is absolved of this obligation. If a Khilafat does not exist anywhere in the Muslim world, if there is no land anywhere in the Muslim world where Sharia is the law of the land, then we are collectively sinful. May Allah forgive us. We live in a time where for 100 years we have failed in this obligation. May Allah forgive us and allow us to see the restoration of the Khilafat in our lifetime. But this is very clear. If you open any book of fiqh, according to any madhab, it is a fard kifaya. And again, if you go to the Ummatics website, they have translated passages from the books of fiqh of all four madhabs, proving this to be a fard kifaya in each and every madhab. There is no madhab that says this is not important. Every madhab considers it a fard kifaya. So, why should we have a Khalifa, and what does a Khalifa do? We mentioned in previous videos that the actual law in Islam is the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is interpreted by the ulama, verdicts are given by the muftis, judgments are made by the qadis. So what does the Khalifa do? If someone is put into this position of being a Khalifa, what exactly does he do? He doesn't make the law. That's left up to the ulama based on interpreting Quran and Sunnah. So what exactly is expected from the Khalifa? I have extracted a few points from different books of fiqh and history, particularly from the Hanafi books of fiqh, of what is the obligations and the expectations from a Khalifa. Number one is jihad fi sabilillah. The number one objective of the Khalifa is to govern the Muslim army, to ensure that Darul Islam is protected. This is done to two types of jihad. Defensive jihad, which is protecting the borders of the Muslim land from invasion, and expansive jihad, which is expanding the borders of Darul Islam by conquering nearby regions. Both of these are on the Khalifa. It is the Khalifa's job to make strategic military decisions on which lands to invade, which lands to make peace with, where to place the armies, how to defend the borders, how to fund the army, who should be in the army. All of these things, it's on the Khalifa. A lot of the work of the Khalifa comes down to governing the Muslim army. He will hire people to do this. He will have a shura committee. He'll have military generals, right? He'll have strategists. But it's really his responsibility to ensure that Darul Islam is protected and expanding. Protected because there will always be enemies of Islam trying to destroy Islam, as they did over and over again. Whether it was the Reconquista of Spain, the Mongol invasion of Baghdad, the Crusader invasion of Jerusalem, or the abolishment of the Ottoman Caliphate in World War I, the enemies of Islam have proven over and over again that if they get a chance to conquer the Muslim lands and massacre the Muslims, they will do so. And they are able to do so today in Palestine because there is no Khalifa to defend the borders, to make sure the armies go out, to ensure that the Muslim lands are protected. So the primary objective of the Khilafat is jihad fi sabilillah. He controls the army. He decides where do they go, who do they fight, who do they make peace with, which borders have more guards and which ones do not. And you always find historically the Khalifa is involved in the issue of jihad. Right from the very beginning, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu puts together the armies, sends them to fight the apostates, the false prophets, the Persians, the Romans. Umar radiallahu anhu sends the armies out to conquer Palestine, Syria, Egypt, Persia, and on throughout our history you will find that jihad, it always goes back to the Khalifa. The Khalifa is the one that gives legitimacy to a war, right? That he will make these political decisions that we are going to invade this land, or we are going to set an army on that land, and things like that. And that's why when Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders, the ulama of Jerusalem ran away to Baghdad and demanded a meeting with the Khalifa to convince the Khalifa to send an army to make jihad against the Crusaders. Fortunately, they failed to do so because the Khalifa at that time was weak and ineffective. But it just shows that their number one solution was the Khalifa needs to solve this. It's his duty to wage jihad against the Crusaders. So this is a primary objective of the Khilafah, to wage jihad against the enemies of Islam. I need to stop here and just do a bit of a side note. Many Muslims today find the concept of jihad al-talab, expansive jihad, to be difficult to understand and swallow, right? A lot of Muslims have been raised with this false idea that jihad is only defensive, or it's only jihad of the nafs and there's no physical fighting in Islam. It's all lies. This is falsehood. This is lying about the religion. Anyone who studies the books of fiqh or the history of Islam, it is very clear that conquests and invading enemy lands and expanding the borders of Darul Islam is something that is built into our Sharia. It is a legitimate form of jihad, and at times a necessary form of jihad. The idea is that for people to experience life under Islam and to see the justice of Islam and to see the truth of Islam, they need to see the Sharia in action. And they cannot do that if they're living outside the borders of Darul Islam. So Muslims would conquer a land, the people of that land would remain upon their religion, they would be ruled by Muslims, they would interact with Muslims, and over a few centuries, one family at a time, they would voluntarily convert to Islam until that becomes a Muslim region. Islam was not forced upon people at the point of the sword. The jihad of expansion was about taking over a land and bringing it under the justice of the Sharia. But the people were left to their religions. They paid the jizya and they were left to their religions. And the fact that most of those lands today are now majority Muslim lands simply shows that this was a very effective form of da'wah, because people eventually embraced Islam. And we have to understand that right and wrong is decided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not by modern liberal theories, right? So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has built into His law the idea of an expansive warfare to expand the borders of Darul Islam, then that is what is right, and that is what is good. It's not a bad thing. I know people growing up today think that any kind of invading and conquering another land is a bad thing. No, it's not. It's actually good for the people. If the early generations didn't conquer the lands that our forefathers were from, we may not be Muslims today. This is how Islam reached our forefathers. Right? This is how many lands became Islamic lands. So please do not be apologetic about the fact that jihad or talab is part of our religion. Yes, the Khalifa has to be the one to make these decisions. There is no real jihad or talab without a Khilafat. And at the same time, to deny that it's part of our religion is changing the religion. And I really can't stand that level of apologetics. We need to be very clear about what Islam teaches. And the books of fiqh and history are very clear that expansive jihad is part of our religion. So, on the borders, the Khalifa's job is protect the borders, expand the borders. Right? Within the borders, the Khalifa's job is to ensure peace and justice. Make sure there's no rebellions, there's no Muslims fighting with each other or with the non-Muslim communities, that justice is being done by the governors and the qadis and whoever is in charge. The Khalifa is the one who handles this. So the qadis will be in charge of dealing with the people in terms of giving religious verdicts and judgments. And the governors would be ruling specific regions, because obviously one man can't rule every region, right? So he would appoint people to rule over specific regions. But if anybody had a complaint about a governor or a qadi, they could go to the Khalifa, right? And the Khalifa would be the one to investigate and fire that person and replace them with somebody better if it's proven to be true. In this way, it was part of their job to ensure peace and justice within the borders of Islam, which for the bulk of our history is what they did. Yes, here and there were a few tyrants and there were a few people who abused their power, but for the bulk of our history, the average person living on the ground lived a very peaceful life, and they didn't have to worry about the government overstepping or being unjust to them or controlling their lives. It was peace and justice was the de facto norm for the average Muslim living within Darul Islam, and for the average non-Muslim within Darul Islam as well. The third primary objective of the Khilafat is to facilitate the implementation of Sharia and to uphold the boundaries of Allah, the hudud. Now we need to do a whole separate lesson on what is the hudud and why do they exist and how they are implemented. But just for now, the Sharia is Allah's law, right? So in a Khilafat, the law of the land is Allah's law. This is absolute, this is number one. Any other laws that are implemented must be complementary to this, they must be underneath this, they must fit within this, they cannot contradict this. The Sharia is at the top, anything else is secondary, right? And so this is really what a Khilafat is about. The Khilafat is about having a land where Allah's law is the law of the land instead of laws made by the government. And so in a Khilafat, people live by the Sharia, right? And they judge their disputes by the Sharia. And public order is upheld by the Sharia. And the symbol of this is the hudud. The hudud, the boundaries of Allah or the Islamic criminal law system, is the symbol of that land being a Sharia land. And nowadays, a lot of people, when they think about the Khilafat or Sharia, they only think about hudud, right? They think that it's all about the hudud. So what are the hudud? Again, we'll do a whole separate video on this, but the hudud, for example, is the amputating of the hand of a professional thief, or the stoning to death of an adulterer whose adultery was publicly witnessed or confessed, right? Or the lashing of a public drunkard, of someone who accuses others of zina. These are called the hudud. These are the limits of Allah. That they are very severe and violent punishments mentioned in the Quran and Hadith for about 5 or 6 specific crimes. And these punishments became categorized as hudud and qisas. Hudud are the ones where the punishment is fixed and it's a very specific punishment and very violent, like chopping off a hand or stoning to death or 100 lashes. And qisas is equivalent punishment, where it's put into the hands of a person that if the family member was killed, they can seek retribution or blood money, or if somebody hurt them, they can seek revenge or some kind of equality. So these are 2 types of laws that exist in Islam, and this is something that's considered very controversial today. We will do a whole separate video on it, but just for now to understand that the way the Sharia is designed, the hudud are almost never applied, right? It's built into the Sharia that the hudud are avoided at all costs. They are there mainly to be a psychological scare tactic, to make people realize how evil these crimes are, how evil these sins are. You don't want to go there, you don't want to do these things, you don't want to touch these sins. But the conditions set for these punishments to be carried out, specifically for the stoning to death and the cutting off the hands of the thief, the conditions set for these are so high that, I read earlier today that in the entire 500-year history of Istanbul, only 1 person was stoned to death. In 500 years, 1. And can you imagine how strict the conditions must be that it takes once in 500 years for this to be applied? For the bulk of history, it's like this law is non-existent. It takes on a symbolic role in the Khilafat. That if you are a Muslim living under Islamic law, you think twice about stealing because you could lose your hand. You think twice about cheating on your spouse because you could be stoned to death. Even though the reality is, if you steal, you're more likely to go to jail or get caned. And if you commit zina, you're more likely no one's ever going to find out. And even if they do, they might just, give you some kind of a light punishment because there's no way to prove it to the level where you get stoned, right? And so ensuring that the hudud are there to be implemented in such situations, I call them worst case scenarios. So I say that the hudud are only implemented in worst case scenarios. For example, if a man and a woman committed zina, if a married man and woman committed zina in such a public way that 4 pious men witnessed his private part entering her private part, then they both will be stoned to death. Realistically, when does this ever happen? It never happens. It never happens. Nobody does. This is a sin that is committed in secret of secrets, in a way that nobody will ever know and nobody will ever find out. Then it becomes a private sin between that person and Allah that they need to make tawbah for. And even if they had to confess to a mufti or a judge about what they did, they would advise them, keep it to yourself and make tawbah. Because the default ruling is to avoid the hudud at all costs. It has to be a worst case scenario where, like, okay, you really messed up here. There's no other way to punish you. We have to give you the worst possible punishment. And that rarely ever happens. So, in a Khilafat, the law of the land is the Sharia. And the hudud are there. The hudud are part of the Sharia. But they make up less than 5% of the Sharia. And they are almost never applied. And the Qadi's job is to avoid the hudud as much as possible and to try his best to never have to give a hard punishment to anyone. So they exist more as a psychological barrier between people and sin. That's really the primary purpose of the hudud, to scare people away from sin. But in practice, we avoid it at all costs. And again, we'll cover this in a separate video on the hudud, where I will give you actual quotations from the books of fiqh, where the scholars say this. Right, like if you open the Hanafi books of fiqh to the chapter of stealing, the first thing it says is that this punishment must be avoided at all costs, and only carried out when there's no other way. When like somebody had actually reached a level where there is no other punishment that you can give, you have to give them the worst possible punishment. Otherwise, the government has and the judge had the right to set lesser punishments for other types of stealing or public indecency, based on whatever they will, right? We'll come to that inshallah when we discuss the concept of ta'zir and qanun. So understand the Khalifa, his duties are jihad, justice, and sharia, and upholding the hudud. The Khalifa is also meant to unite the Muslims behind a single leader. Historically, this is something Muslims failed at after the first 2 generations. For the bulk of our history, there were always 2 or 3 people claiming to be the Khalifa at the same time. However, functionally, it was still better than what we have today. Because functionally, even if you lived at the time where there was, for example, the Ottomans and the Mamluks and the Mughals all existing at the same time, or the Fatimids and the Abbasids and the Umayyads all existing at the same time, for the average person, life in any of these lands was the same. And there was no boundaries between these lands. There were no borders between these lands. And you didn't need a passport or a visa to move from one of these lands to the other. And so, whether you were living under Umayyad Spain or Abbasid Baghdad, the law that is being applied is the same. And so the quality of life may differ based on economic factors, but in terms of this having any practical negative impact on the lives of people, it didn't. It didn't really have a practical negative impact on the lives of the average person. But nonetheless, this is a failure of the Ummah. Right, but again, a sign of the human nature of our history. Our history is very human. So even though technically, as per the books of fiqh, there should be only one Khalifa, to an extent that the hadith states if 2 people claim to be the Khalifa, the second one should be executed. But historically, there's very few points in our history where this ideal was achieved, and for the bulk of our history, there were multiple people claiming to be the Khalifa at the same time. Nonetheless, at least all the other conditions were met, that Sharia was the law of the land, and jihad was being done on the borders, and within the people, within those borders, peace and justice was established. Another thing that the Khalifa does, and this isn't necessary, this is secondary, and this is something that evolved over time, is administrative work required for the success of the empire. So obviously, as the empire grows and as the Muslims become more powerful and they're ruling more lands and more issues are coming up, government gets more and more complicated. And it's the Khalifa's job to ensure that everything is functional, everything's working properly. And so we find as the Khilafat evolves over time, they develop more and more administrative systems to ensure it's functioning properly. So in the beginning, it's a very simple system, right? In the beginning, in the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, there's not much administrative work involved with the Khilafat, because it's just Arabia that's ruled by the Muslims, which are mostly tribal societies, and not much written work is needed to manage that, just ensuring that the jizya and the zakah is collected and that is documented. As time grows, for example, once they conquer Spain, then we have administrative work being done to ensure that they understand the newly conquered lands and their needs and what's going on. Then you need to have a registry of the governors and their salaries to be transparent about that, and a registry of the army and the soldiers, so we know who's part of the Muslim army. And as time goes by, the administrative work gets more and more. So by the time of the Ottoman Empire, you have things like land ownership records, marriage certificates. It gets more and more. And again, it's not done by one person, but the Khalifa is at the top, and the system is developed through him, and he's really the one handling things at the highest level. And over time, this became the bulk of the Khalifa's work, because if the borders are protected and there's peace treaties with nearby lands, and the Sharia is the law of the land, and the Qadis are handling that, and the Fuqaha are handling that, what exactly is the Khalifa doing on a day-to-day basis? He's handling administrative work. He's checking the records. He's checking on the governors. He's checking on the Qadis. He's checking on the army. He's ensuring there's enough money coming in through the zakah and the jizya and the other types of taxes. And he gets caught up in administrative work to ensure that the government and the country is functioning properly. Linked to that is the collection and distribution of taxes, including zakah and jizya. So again, because we don't live in a khilafat, many of us are unaware of this, but for the bulk of our history, zakah was something done through the government. It is the government who would send out zakah collectors to collect the zakah from people and put it into the Baytul Mal, where it will be distributed accordingly. This would go towards the salaries of the zakah collectors, towards the Muslim, funding the Muslim army, towards helping the poor, to setting up charitable projects, to a variety of different things. So zakah was actually a state fund. It was a type of tax, a state fund that the poor had a right to. The poor had a share in it, but others did as well. Because we don't live in a khilafat, we are tasked with distributing our own zakah, and because we don't have all these different categories today, we end up just giving it to the poor, which is the primary category of the recipients. The jizya was another tax that the Khalifa would ensure is collected and used as part of the Baytul Mal. So the Muslims would pay zakah, and the non-Muslims would pay jizya. And jizya, there was no set amount for it. For the bulk of our history, it actually was less than the zakah. Right? At many points in our history, jizya was actually lower than the zakah. And so it's a very small percentage of one's money compared to the taxes that people pay today. I find this very hilarious, actually, that non-Muslims today, the Islamophobes, when they want to attack Islam, they're like, oh, Islam is so evil, it makes non-Muslims pay jizya. If they pay jizya just to follow another religion. Well, hold on. Jizya is actually much lower than the taxes you are paying today. Furthermore, you get full freedom of religion through jizya. To such an extent, you can have your own village with your own religion, with your own judges from your own religion, where you can actually apply the criminal law of your religion. Like, this is a level of freedom of religion that's not found anywhere in the West. Furthermore, you don't have any military duties, right? Non-Muslims who pay jizya are protected by the state. It is the duty of the mujahideen to protect them. So the taxes are less than what you'd pay in the West. The freedom of religion is more than what exists today. And on top of that, you have no military duties. Why are you making this a scare tactic? Why are you making this sound like something negative? Historically, many non-Muslims preferred to live under Sharia and pay the jizya compared to living under other systems, right? So we find that the Jews, for example, for the bulk of their history, they lived in Muslim lands. They paid the jizya because that was really the only way for them to survive and to be able to get their rights. They tried living anywhere else, the Christians would massacre them. It was only Muslims who gave them their full rights. And we see this with other Christian denominations as well. So these were the taxes, right? Zakah, jizya, farm taxes, war booty, and there may be at times that the government may have administered other taxes for whatever reasons. There's a legal dispute on whether that is halal or haram, but some Muslim governments did do it anyway, regardless of what the dispute says. But again, it was the government's job to collect the taxes and make sure that they are distributed properly and that they go to the correct categories. And finally, again, this may sound weird to some of you, it was the duty of the Khalifa to be the Imam of Jummah in his town and to appoint the Imams of Jummah for all the other towns, where they would praise the Khalifa in the khutbah as a way of showing legitimacy to the Khalifa, right? So historically, Jummah and Eid were very political. Today, those of us that live in the West as minorities, we don't really think of Jummah or Eid as anything political. Like we have, like in my neighborhood alone, there are like 20 Jummahs, right? Islamically, you're not supposed to do that, but you don't really have a choice as a minority. Islamically, every town should have a Jummah masjid. And on the day of Friday, all the other masjids are closed. And everybody gathers at the Jummah masjid and prays behind one imam. That imam is the most important person in that community. It could be the Khalifa, the governor, the chief qadi, the Shaykhul Islam. The Khalifa chooses who's the imam for each area. And that imam would give a khutbah to the people, including in it a reminder of who the Khalifa is and praising him for doing a good job and ensuring that people understand and accept the legitimacy of the Khalifa of that time. And so it's actually the duty of the Khalifa to lead the Jummah, to lead the Eid Salah in the town where he lives, and in other towns to appoint people to do so. And when I say lead in their name, I don't mean, like in any shirky way. I mean like as a representative of them. I don't misunderstand it. I could have worded that better. So that's it. Yeah, that's what the Khilafat is. It's very radically different from any system of law that exists today, even in the Muslim world. The Khalifa doesn't make the law, except in secondary issues, which the Sharia is silent about. Even there, he consults the scholars. The Khalifa is not policing people's lives, because in Islam you have to value the privacy of people's private lives. You're not allowed to look for people's private sins or what they're doing behind closed doors. So for the most part, people self-governed. The Khalifa is not an absolute ruler. If he tries to dismantle the Sharia, he can be overthrown and replaced with another Khalifa, as it happened many times in our history. His job is to fight the enemies of Islam, to ensure that Sharia is the law of the land, and to handle the state functions of the Sharia, which includes collecting and distributing the zakah and the jizya, ensuring justice, implementing the hudud when necessary, and leading the Jummah. That's the role of the Khalifa. And I added administrative work there because you may be wondering, what do they do when they don't have any of this to do? It's administrative work. Right? It's not necessary, it's not mentioned specifically in the books of fiqh, but historically that becomes what the Khalifa does when he's not doing any of these other things, or at least what he does to manage all these other things. So this is the Khilafat, and what we're going to do for the rest of today's lesson, I will go very briefly through the history of the Khilafat, but depending on time, I may have to break during this. Again, we're talking about summarizing 1,400 years of history into like 15 minutes. I'm not going to do the history of every single Khalifa that lived, but just the systems that developed. And again, go back to the paper by Dr. Miranjo, Who Wants a Khilafat. He discusses this in a lot of detail. So a large portion of the paper is a brief history of the Khilafat and the different types of Khilafat that existed at each point in our history. So the Khilafat begins with the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passes away, and Abu Bakr is appointed as his Khalifa, for 2.5 years, followed by Umar ibn al-Khattab for 10 years, followed by Uthman ibn Affan for 12 years, followed by Ali radiallahu anhu for 6 years, and then Hassan radiallahu anhu for 6 months. I'm not going to go into the details of everything that happened during that time. I covered all of this in our History of Islam course. This period is the golden age spiritually. It's called the Khulafa Rashidin, the rightly guided Khilafat, based on the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that after he passes away there will be 30 years of rightly guided Khalifas, and after that there will be a kingship, there will be a monarchy. And so from that hadith, scholars have said that this is the Khulafa Rashidin period, this is the rightly guided period. What stands out in this period is that the Khalifa is a man of the people. He's a simple, humble man who lives in a place where he's easily accessible to the public. He is both ruler and scholar. He is a pious man. He is a scholar who understands the Sharia and fiqh, and who is qualified to be a qadi. He is the ruler of the Muslim world. At this point in time, the Khalifa is both. So in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, for example, he is leading the armies. He is telling them where to go, which lands to conquer, which armies to fight. He is handling the administrative work. He is collecting the jizya and the zakah. But he also is sitting with the people, hearing their problems, judging between them, solving their disputes, visiting people's homes. It's a very down-to-earth type of leadership. This is the ideal. An ideal that would never be reached again in our history. The Ummah grew too big and too powerful and too wealthy and too diverse to have this kind of leadership working in the long run. The Khilafat was possible in this beautiful way when the Ummah was small, and when the majority of the people who they were leading were the Sahaba and the Tabi'in. But even this period is not perfect. There is no period in history that is perfect, because we are humans, our history is human. Abu Bakr had to deal with an apostasy crisis, literally had to wage war against apostates. Umar radiallahu anhu is murdered in Medina while he is the Imam for Fajr. Uthman radiallahu anhu faces months of rebellion leading up to his murder in Medina in Dhul Hijjah. Ali radiallahu anhu has to deal with a civil war between the Sahaba. So even the spiritual golden age, when we had the absolute best form of Khilafat ever, there are still trials, there are still fitnas, there are still things that go wrong, because this is the human experience. Life is a test. Everybody is tested. Even the best of generations are tested. No matter how perfect a political system is, there will still be tests. And I have to mention this because too many people today have this fantasy that if we have a Khilafat, all of our problems will be solved. No. If we have a Khilafat, certain problems will be solved. Specific problems will be solved. But there will always be problems, because life is a test. If life is a test, there will always be problems. So don't be naive and think that this is a magic solution for solving all our problems. No. The Khilafat is necessary for solving a specific set of problems. But even under the best of Khalifas, there will always be problems, because we are human and this world is a test. And humans in a world that is a test, there's always going to be something going wrong. So this is the golden age spiritually. We have the most righteous leaders that the Ummah has ever seen. Really, this is the time period that we study the most after the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And specifically the reign of Umar ibn al-Khattab is studied in a lot of details for understanding how Sharia works. As he ruled, he had the longest peaceful rule from all of them, right? So Uthman technically ruled longer, but a large portion of that was dealing with civil unrest. In terms of a rule that was stable, Umar radiallahu anhu had the longest stable rule, and they have a lot of lessons and gems that we can take from it. So we'll actually look at the reign of Umar ibn al-Khattab as one of our case studies of what a Khilafat looks like. So, Umar radiallahu anhu's period, right up to that of Hassan radiallahu anhu, is called from Abu Bakr to Hassan, this 30-year period is called the rightly guided Khilafat. We said after that there would be a monarchy, as Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam predicted. And a monarchy is not necessarily a bad thing. I know a lot of us today think it's a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think historically it was a necessity. Historically, It was a necessary evolution of the Khilafat to preserve it to be functional as an empire. Because at this point in time now the Muslims are ruling an empire. Very soon thereafter, Muslims ruled all the way from Spain to India. To rule such a large portion of land while avoiding civil unrest and people fighting over the Khilafat, there needed to be some stability. There needed to be some system in place where the average person could forget about politics and focus on their business and worshipping Allah and their families instead. And the monarchy fixed all of this. Really, having a monarchy system just made things so much easier for the average person. The average person didn't have to think about politics. There's one family handling all of that. The average person could focus on living a Sharia compliant lifestyle, earning a halal income, raising their family, worshipping Allah, and they could just put this aside. So what happens is Muawiyah radiallahu anhu becomes the Khalifa, worried that upon his death there would be civil war over the Khilafat. He appoints his son Yazid as the next Khalifa. And this sets a precedent of appointing your son as the next Khalifa, which turns the Ummah into a political system into a monarchy. As it will remain for the rest of our history. Really, for the rest of our history, the Khilafat is now a monarchy. And I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. Yeah, the Khilafat of Yazid was a disaster. But the system of a monarchy was, and the idea that Muawiyah had was not necessarily a bad thing, because it created a sense of stability and power in the Ummah that may not have been possible if there was a election of a Khalifa every time the Khalifa passed away. So what happens now is, in the monarchy system, there is now a split. You have the royal family that has the Khilafat, and it's passed down from father to son, brother to brother, brother to cousin, whatever it is. It stays within a family, a royal family. They handle jihad, they handle administration, they handle the collecting and distribution of zakah. There's now a separate power structure that rises. Right? At this point in time, the ulama split away from the khulafa, and they kind of becomes almost like an animosity between them. Like, ulama stop trusting the khalifas. And the Khalifas have to constantly prove themselves to be legitimate by not harming the ulama and letting them do their work. And so now we have a split power structure. You have the Khalifa, the royal family, who are handling jihad, the administration and collection of taxes. And you have the ulama who are interpreting the Sharia, writing the books of fiqh, making fatwa, doing the work of judging between the people and ensuring that Sharia is implemented. And both systems seem to work well, side by side. Yes, there's a few clashes here and there. We do know most of the famous fuqaha at different points in their life clashed with the Khalifas over specific issues, and sometimes went to jail and other things like that happen. But those are the exceptions, not the norm. The norm was that these two structures happen to coexist. And so for the bulk of our history, the Khilafat is a monarchy, and there's a royal family that's taking care of all of these things. And the law of the land is interpreted and applied by the scholars. And these two structures coexist with each other. The Umayyad monarchy doesn't last very long. People grow tired of their luxurious lifestyle and their lavish parties and their usurping of wealth of people. And they do a lot of things wrong that cause people to turn against them. And instead, people start to support the Abbasids, the descendants of Abbas, who are another political party that rises up at this time and say that we're going to do things differently, that we're going to do things more like the Sahaba did. So there is a coup, and the Abbasids take over, and nothing changes. This is the irony of it, right? The Abbasids had promised that they're going to bring things back to the way it was in the time of the Khulafa Rashidin, and they're going to bring the Khilafat back to the Prophet's family, and they make all of these false promises. They come into power, they rule for 250 years, and the system is exactly the same. The system under the Umayyads and the Abbasids is exactly the same. It's just a different Qurayshi tribe. The Umayyads, Banu Umayyah, is one branch of the Quraysh, and the Abbasids are a different branch of the Quraysh. And actually what happens here is, at this point, they split, and there's no longer one Khalifa. because the Abbasids tried to get rid of all of the Umayyads, but they failed to do so, and one young Umayyad prince escapes to Spain and establishes a separate Umayyad state in Spain. So now you have Umayyad Spain and Abbasid Empire coexisting with each other. You now have two Khilafats coexisting. Again, the system of leadership is exactly the same. Life in both empires is the same for the most part, except for economics and culture and things like that. Both are monarchies. Both the rulers are focused on the jihad and administration and collecting and distribution of taxes, and the ulama are the ones who are interpreting the law and who are serving as qadis and who are applying the law. So the system remains the same. Things start to fall apart after this. The Abbasids very quickly lose control over their lands. My personal theory is that the ummah grew too big for one person to manage, and cracks start to form, and different people start to independently run their lands how they want to run it. And so we now have multiple khilafats, and we have local leaders who claim to follow the Abbasids, but they're doing their own things. But functionally, again, for the average Muslim on the ground, life remains the same. Sharia is the law of the land. The ulama and the qadis are the ones who are interpreting and applying the law, and it doesn't really matter who the ruler is, right? But something negative happens at this point. So the Abbasids actually were in power for 600 years. But only in the first 200 to 250 years there's like real power. What happens after this is the Abbasid Khalifa becomes basically a figurehead. It becomes really a joke that everyone says that, oh, the Abbasids are the Khalifas, and we are loyal to the Abbasid Khalifa. But at this point in time, the Khalifa has absolutely no power. Power has been usurped by the military generals, by the governors, by his advisors, and the Abbasid Khalifa just does whatever they say. This is one of the darkest periods in our history. Compared to the period we're in now, this is the other period that's the darkest period in our history. The Abbasid Empire is severely weakened. The Khalifa has like no real power at all. There's a lot of infighting in the Ummah, people fighting over political power and claiming to be Khalifas and claiming to be regional leaders and tribal leaders. And during this time, the Crusaders invade, they take over Jerusalem, they massacre the Muslims, a genocide takes place, and then as soon as that is resolved, the Mongols invade, they dismantle the Abbasid Khilafat, and they massacre the Muslims of Baghdad, and that's it. The Arab leadership of the Muslims is over, and for those who believe that the Khalifa has to be from the Quraysh, you could say the Khilafat is over. What happens after this? The Ummah reaches one of its darkest points when the Mongols invade and dismantle the Khilafat of the Abbasids. And the Abbasids at that time are so weak and so useless that there's nothing they can do about it. And they are defeated. In the rubble of the fall of the Abbasids, multiple empires arise. Some claim to be Khalifas, some claim to be Sultans, some claim to giving allegiance to a Khalifa that doesn't, in my view, doesn't really exist. So basically at this point in time you have the Mamluks, who are a group of freed slaves, or even a group of slaves actually, who are ruling over Egypt. They managed to fight off the Mongols. They claim to be in power through the Abbasids. So they had a very technical way of claiming power. They were slaves, and technically the slave can't be the Khalifa. So they had a puppet Abbasid with them, and they would say, oh, this guy is the Khalifa and we're just ruling on his behalf. But really, the Mamluks ruled, and the Abbasid with them was a completely useless individual who had no real power. At the same time, you have the Mughals, right? So the Mongols end up converting to Islam, and multiple Muslim empires come out from them, including the Mughals of India. Same time, you have the Safavids, the Shia leaders in Persia, and you have the Ottomans, right? The Ottoman Sultanate arising in Turkey as a response to the Mongol and the Crusader invasions. So now the Ummah is split into all these different kingdoms. But again, the law of the land is still the Sharia. It's still the ulama who are interpreting the Sharia, the qadis who are applying the Sharia. And these different leaders, they're really competing with each other for legitimacy. Who's the real Khalifa? It's very unclear at this point in our history if there is a Khalifa, and if there is one, who it is. And for about 200 or 300 years, it's very, very murky as to whether there actually is a Khalifa in the Ummah. Some would say that this is an Abbasid era, and they say the Abbasid Empire goes on for another 200 years. But really, if you read the history books, the Abbasids are completely absent from this point in history. If they do exist, they are just complete figureheads with no power at all. Very interestingly, the Ottomans rise to power slowly. And within about 200 years, the Ottomans grow so powerful that they conquer Constantinople, turn it into Istanbul, make it their capital. Then they conquer Jerusalem and Makkah and Medina from the Mamluks, dismantling the Mamluk Empire. And then they claim to be a Khilafat. Then they claim to be the Khilafat. And this is where again things get murky. Ever since the downfall of the Abbasid Empire, it's very murky and unclear if there is a Khalifa, and if there is one, who is the Khalifa. At this point, it gets more murky because from this point onwards until 1924, the Ottomans have the strongest claim to the Khilafat because they are this mighty Muslim empire, just as powerful as early Umayyad and Abbasid empires. They rule over 25 million people across 3 continents. They may wage jihad against the enemies of Islam. They apply the Sharia. They uphold the hudud. They're doing everything that you expect from the Khalifa. They control the Holy Lands and ensure that all Muslims have access to the Holy Lands. But they're not Qurayshi. They're Turks. And so there is this tension in this point of history. Do we consider the Ottomans to be Khalifas or Sultans? I consider them to be Khalifas based on what I mentioned earlier. What's interesting with the Ottomans is there seems to be less tension between the ulama and the Khalifa in the Ottoman Empire compared to the Umayyad or the Abbasid Empire. We said in the Umayyad and Abbasid Empire, ulama were very wary of the Khalifa, and they would operate as a separate power structure from the Khalifa, doing their own things. Right? They would fight to maintain their independence. They did not want to be dependent on the Khalifa for anything. With the Ottomans, the Khalifa and the ulama work very closely together, to such an extent that they end up working together to codify the law and to modernize the Khilafat. It's a very interesting thing that takes place over a 300-year period, that the Ottomans, working together with ulama, try to figure out how can we modernize the Khilafat in a way where the Sharia is still the main law, the hudud are still upheld, but the way things function on a day-to-day basis is more modern, it's more in keeping with the times. And especially in the 1800s, a lot of reforms took place in the Ottoman Empire to try and modernize the empire. And so this is the closest we have to a modern Khilafat and what a Khilafat would look like today. Sadly, World War I takes place, the Ottomans lose, the British and the French take over the Muslim world, the Khilafat is abolished, the nation-state model is introduced, and we end up in the mess we are in today of political weakness, sectarianism, secularism, tribalism, nationalism, Israel, all of this that we in today happens, and for 100 years there has been no Khalifa. So you can see that our history it's very human. Right? Specifically, only the first 400 500 years is really stable and good. After that, things unravel very quickly, and then we do have a second period of greatness with the Ottomans. But even then, too, in terms of legitimacy and in terms of meeting all the conditions, there is questions around whether they could legitimately call themselves a Khilafat or not. Nonetheless, what we can say for sure is that the Ottoman Empire was way better than what the Muslim world has today. That if it did cover all of those functions that we mentioned: jihad, sharia, hudud, peace, justice, administration, collection of the zakah, leading the salah. It did all of that. So only flaw is what it wasn't Arab. And the British used this against it by bribing some of the Arabs to turn against the Ottomans and fight on the side of the British, causing the collapse of the empire. and we end up in the mess we are in today. So we'll stop here. We went a bit over time today. And tomorrow we will look at the types of khilafats based on what we just said. We'll analyze in each of these periods what was unique and different about the khilafat in each period in time, and how was it functionally different from the khilafat that existed before, and what lessons can we take from that about how Sharia law functions, what is fixed and what is flexible. We'll go into that in the next video. Jazakallah khairan wa akhir dawana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.